In this video we're going to look at the Alpine AJAX plugin for Alpine.js, and this is an extension that allows us to fetch hypermedia from a server via an AJAX request and then brings that content into the document at a given target element. Now this is very similar to HTMX. It fetches hypermedia from a server and it replaces targets in the document in a particular way, but it does this as part of the Alpine ecosystem. So it's going to be a different approach that we're going to show, but it's going to be very familiar if you're already aware of how HTMX works and how it might integrate with Alpine. So before we get started, it would be great if you would give the video a thumbs up and subscribe on the channel if you've not already done so. And let's dive in. We're here on the Alpine AJAX page, and as it says, it's a plugin that enables your HTML elements to request remote content from the server. And this can be used in a similar way to HTMX to build straightforward, robust and interactive websites. Now in this video I'm going to show an example with Django, and I'm going to do a follow-up video with Go, but these concepts can be used in any back-end programming language or back-end framework. Now I'll leave a link to this page below the video. We're going to go to the reference documentation here and we can see how we can install both Alpine and this extension Alpine AJAX. So we can do this via a CDN, which we can just place into our HTML files, or if you're using npm, you can also do it through npm as well. You can just run the npm install command and it will bring that into your project. So what we're going to do is, to keep things simple, we're just going to copy the script tags here and we're going to place them into a Django project. So I'm going to copy these and let's go to VS Code where I have a Django project open. And I'm going to go to the templates directory and we're going to go to a file called base.html. And at the top here I've got an import for Bootstrap. I'm going to paste the Alpine and Alpine AJAX imports into this document. Now the order is important here. If we go back to the documentation, you can see that you have to import Alpine AJAX before you import the core Alpine.js module. Now once we've done that, what we're going to do to start with is take a quick look at the usage section here. Now the documentation says it's good practice to start building your UI without Alpine AJAX, so you can make sure your entire website would work as if Alpine AJAX was not available, and then you can sprinkle in these AJAX functionalities at the end. Let's have a look at some of the attributes that are added to Alpine.js by this extension or this plugin. We have the xTarget attribute here, and what this does is it's something you can add to your forms or your links to enable this AJAX behavior. So if you're familiar with HTMX, this would be similar to something like an hxGet or an hxPost attribute. And not only those attributes, but also the hxTarget attribute itself, because the value of this attribute should equal the ID of an element on the page that the form or the link should target. So let's take a quick look at the example here. We have an unordered list with an ID of comments that contains a single comment. Below that we have a form element, and this form contains standard attributes such as the method when it's submitted, which is a post request, and the action, which specifies the endpoint where the posted data will be sent. And that's an endpoint on your server, whether it's Django or Laravel or whatever you're using. But notice these attributes here. We have some Alpine attributes. Notably, we have xInit on this form element. And we also have the xTarget attribute that's added by the Alpine AJAX extension. And that's set to the element ID here of comments. And that targets this unordered list that we have above. So basically, when the button is clicked and we submit this form, the value that has been entered into this input element will be sent to the server, and that will be done in an AJAX request because of this xTarget attribute added by Alpine AJAX. Now this plugin expects to get back hypermedia content, so some HTML that we can then swap into the page, and that content can then be swapped into the page at the ID of this target here. So we have an unordered list and that has the ID of comments. When we get back a response after submitting that form, the response content is going to be swapped in and it's going to replace this element here with the ID of comments. That's the default strategy. We'll see later in the video how we can also use different strategies, just like you would do with the hxSwap attribute in HTMX. So that's a bit of explanation to get started. What we're going to do now is go to our Django project where we have now the Alpine and Alpine AJAX imports. And to start with, let's look at the Django view. And this is a very simple view called index. It has an empty context and it's returning a template called index.html. Now above that we have some to-dos here, and each to-do has an ID, a name and an isCompleted field. We're going to use these in this video and we're going to build a simple table of to-dos along with a form that allows you to submit a new to-do to the server and use Alpine AJAX to send that request and swap in the response content. So let's get started. We're going to start by adding the to-dos to the Django context that we have and that we're passing to the view. So let's create a key called to-dos and set it equal to that value above. Of course, in a real project, you would probably use a database here, but we're going to keep it simple just to show the functionality of Alpine AJAX in this video. Now what we can do when we have a list of dictionaries that have been added to the context is we can actually create a JSON string from them in our template. So let's go to index.html. We have a very simple Django template here, and we're going to create some HTML in that template. So we're using Bootstrap. We're going to give it a class of container, and that will give some margin to the top and to the sides. And we'll create an h1 tag here, and we're going to call this to-do list. Once we've done that, we're going to take the to-dos that we have here in our context, and we're going to create a script with JSON content based on that data. Now in order to do that, we can use the to-dos variable in the context, and we can use Django's JSON script template tag. And let me try and spell this correctly. And we'll give that an ID of to-do list. Now if you're not familiar with this, we did a video on that previously. It should be appearing on the screen now. This is a way to get your data from the Django server into the context of your document on the client, and we're going to see an example of that now. So let's start the Django development server here, and we're going to go to the browser at localhost 8000. Now you can see on this page it just has a header that says to-do list, but if we inspect the document here, what we're going to do is go to the body, and we're going to look at this container that we added, and notice this script tag here, and this is the type of application/JSON, so this is JSON data, and the to-dos that we had on the server are now present here in this JSON data. So what we're going to do is create an Alpine component and read this data when the page loads, and later we'll use Alpine AJAX to add new data dynamically and fetch hypermedia from the server. So let's get started with that and go back to our template. On this container div, we're going to create an Alpine component, which we can do using the xData attribute. And what we're going to do here is set this to a JavaScript object, and we'll give it a key of to-dos, and we're going to now read the to-dos from this script here. And this parameter of to-do list, you can see that is the actual ID of the script. So we're going to use that ID, and we're going to use some JavaScript to read that into this variable in the Alpine component. So in order to read that, we can use the document.getElementById function, and we pass to-do list into that. We're going to get the text content from that, and that text content is just going to be raw text, but we can call the JSON.parse function in JavaScript. And don't forget to close the function here, and that's going to parse that text content and create a JavaScript object from that data. What we're now going to do is create a table element and show these to-dos using Alpine.js. So let's go down here, and we're going to use the table element and give that a class of table from Bootstrap. Now the table needs a head with the column names. So we have columns for the ID, the name, and whether or not the task or the to-do was completed. So you can add the table head elements here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to add a table body here. And importantly, we're going to give this table body an ID, and that's going to be to-do table body. And the reason for this ID is going to become apparent later, but we're going to use that as the target when we're using Alpine AJAX in order to send and fetch data from the server. So that's our table body with the ID. What we're going to do is we're going to use a template element now, and we're going to use the Alpine.js x4 directive here. So x4, and we're going to loop over the to-dos that we have here in our context. So let's go back to the template element, and we're looping over these. It's going to be to-do and to-dos. So for each one of those to-dos, we want to perform some kind of action. And what we need to do within the context of an HTML table is create a row for each to-do. And then we're going to create a table data element and use the Alpine xText directive. And we're going to reference that to-do, and we're going to reference the properties on the individual to-do. For example, the ID of the to-do. I'm going to copy this line down 2 more times. And as well as the ID, we're going to reference the to-do's name and whether or not it's completed, which is the isCompleted attribute. So is this going to work? Let's go back to the browser and refresh the page. And we're currently getting an empty table at the moment. Let's go to the console, and it looks like I've made an error here. Document.getElementID is not a function, so that's my mistake. If we go back up here, it should be getElementById, so well done if you noticed that. Let's now try this again, go back to our page, and now we get the elements in this table on the browser. So we have the to-do learn Python, and that's currently not completed. Learn Alpine is also not completed, but go to the gym was completed. Now what we want to do now is add a form below this table that allows the user to enter a new to-do, and we're going to use Alpine AJAX to send that request to the server, and the Django server in this case is going to get that request with the data, and it's going to use that data to create a new to-do object and return some hypermedia back to Alpine AJAX that is then going to be swapped in at that target element. So the next step is to add a form below this table. Let's go back to our page here, and just below the table what we're going to do is create a form element. Now let's give the form a method here, and we're going to submit this using a post request, and let's also give the form an actual endpoint to submit to. So we're going to use Django's URL template tag, and I'm going to create a new endpoint called submit to do. Now because we're submitting with a post request, let's also add the CSRF token to this submitted data, and we can close off the form element. Now to speed things up, I'm going to paste two fields into this form. The first one is going to be the name of the to-do item, and we're going to surround these with a div with the class of margin bottom 2 to give it some space between this particular field and the ones below. And then we have an input element, and that's an input of type text where we can enter the name of the to-do item, and we're giving that the bootstrap class of form control, which is going to add some nice styling to that. Now as well as the name of the to-do, we also need to indicate whether or not the to-do has been completed. So let's add another field to this form, and that's going to be for checking whether or not the to-do is completed. So we're giving it a type of checkbox, and the name of that field that we expect on the server is completed, and the value is true. And the final thing to do is allow the user to submit the form using this button that we have at the bottom. So we have an input of type submit, and again using the bootstrap classes of button and button primary. So that's the form. We're not going to be able to see this because we have added a URL that does not currently exist in the Django project. So let's copy the name of that URL, and we're going to go to the urls.py file. So we're going to add another path here, and we'll give it the route of /submit, and we're going to reference a view called submit to do. That doesn't exist at the moment, but we're going to create that in a second. And finally, because we gave the URL a name, we need to reference that here. So that's our new URL. We now need to create the view called submit to do. So let's go over to views.py and create that function submit to do here. So within this function, what we want to do is create a Python dictionary that contains an ID. And I'm going to hard code this to 4 for now, but we need to create the same structure as we had above for these to do objects. So we need a name, and we also need an isCompleted field, and these are going to come from the front end from the form submission. So in order to get that submitted data, we need to reference the request.post attribute in Django. So to get the name of the to-do, we need to use the request.post query dictionary, and we're going to get the name attribute from that. And the reason this is called name is because it matches what we have here in the input element. We gave it a name that was equal to name, so we're going to get that now on the server, and I'm going to copy this line of code down below. We also need to get the isCompleted field, and the name that we had on the form for that was completed, so let's copy that and paste it into this .get method. So now we have a new to-do dictionary in Python. We're going to create a context here, and we're going to create a key called to-do in that context and set that equal to the to-do above. And finally, we're going to, for the moment, render the index.html template, and we're going to return that from this new view. Now let's test this out. It's not going to work at the moment, but we're going to test this out, and gradually we're going to fix the issues and make this work. Now we have this form below the table, and the user interface here is not ideal, but it's going to do for this video. We're going to enter a to-do name, and let's enter the to-do of go to restaurant. And we're not going to check this, but we're going to submit the form, and what we get back now is an empty table, and we have the form below. Now why is the table empty? The reason for that, if we go back to Django, is that we're now returning index.html, but that expects a key called to-dos in the context, which we are not adding here. Instead of that, we only have a single to-do, so we're adding a key called to-do, and therefore the table is empty. Now instead of returning index.html, what I'm going to do is create what's called a template fragment in Django, and you might also see this called a template partial, and I have that here on the left hand side. It's a file called todo.html, so this is going to be an HTML fragment. And if we go back to the documentation for Alpine AJAX, we had this example where we had an X target set to comments. What happens, and what we want to happen, is that when the form is submitted, a post request is issued to the /comment endpoint, and the element with the ID of comments, that list will be replaced with the element that has ID equal to comments in the AJAX response. So what we want to do is we want to replace the body of this table that we have here. So let's go back up to the table. We currently have a table body that contains, for each to-do in the to-dos, a row. But when we submit a new to-do here using this new form that we have, we want to add the new to-do to the table. So we need to return something that's going to allow us to replace the content of that table with the new to-do. Or rather than replace, we actually want to append the new to-do to the existing table. So what we need to do if we want to replace that item is we also need to return a fragment that contains a table body with the same ID. So let's copy that table body into our fragment here, and we'll close that element off. And we're going to create a table row here. And because when we submit a to-do, it's going to create a single to-do item. We don't need any template for loops or anything like that. All we have in the context is a single to-do. So we just need to render the fields of that to-do in this fragment here. So let's create a table data element, and we're going to render out the to-do's ID as the first column. And I'm going to copy this down 2 more times, and again we'll reference the to-do's name and also the is completed field. So we have a template called todo.html that encapsulates a single row within the table body, and that single row can be used here when we create the new to-do when that form is submitted. Now we need to change the template that's being returned from this Django view. So let's do that now. Instead of index.html, we're going to return todo.html. Now let's go back to our page and try submitting this again. When we hit the submit button, we get this very basic page back. Everything else is gone and the entire page has been replaced. Now why is that happening? That's because this is a normal request, it's not an AJAX request, and the content that's being returned to the page, that is all of the content here. So now we actually need to introduce the Alpine AJAX plugin, and that's going to allow us to send that request and get back this partial here. And instead of replacing the entire page, we're going to replace only a target element in the document, and we're going to swap the new content in a particular manner so that it doesn't replace the table rows that are already in the table. So let's go back to index.html, and this is where we submit the new to do. What we're going to do here is add the xTarget directive from Alpine AJAX, and we're going to set that equal to our to-do table body that we have here. So let's copy that, and we're going to paste that as the target ID, and that means that the response content that's coming back after we submit the form should be swapped into that element on the page. And when we add xTarget, it's also going to change the manner in which the request is sent. So rather than a normal request response, instead we're going to send an AJAX request from the client, and we're not going to reload the page. So that's the effect of adding xTarget to our form element. Now let's show that off. If we save this page and go back to the browser, if we submit the form with the to-do of go to restaurant, this time you can see that the table rows have been replaced with our new to-do. So that's different. We have some interactivity going on now that we've added that xTarget directive. We have a target of the table body, but we can see that the previous contents of that table body have been entirely replaced by the new table row that's coming back from the server. So we have this table row, this hypermedia coming back from Django, and it's replacing the entire content of the target element. Now let's go back to the Alpine AJAX documentation, and we're going to learn how to fix this now. If we go to the left-hand sidebar, there is a directive called xmerge. So let's have a look at this. By default, incoming HTML from the server will replace a targeted element. And that's what's happening at the moment. We have a todo.html file that defines a table body with the same ID, and that is entirely replacing the existing table body element that we have here. So in order to append the new content instead of replacing, we can use this xmerge directive. What we do is we add xmerge to a targeted element, and that will change how it merges the incoming content that's coming back from the response. So on the unordered list, if we don't want to replace the list, what we can do is we can add xmerge equals append. So let's copy this directive and go back to our template. So the targeted element is the table body here, so we can add the xmerge onto that, and we're going to set it equal to append. And let's go back to our page now, and let's add go to restaurant in here and submit this. And you can see now that the new row is added to the table, and it's not replacing the previous rows. They are maintained in the table. It's just appending the new row to the existing content in that target element. Now I can see here that completed is set to none, so something's gone wrong there. And I think the problem here is if we look and inspect the contents of that field, we can see that the value is set to true here. Now we want this to be a Boolean value, as you can see in the other rows. So let's go back to our Django view here, and instead of pulling out the text of true, we're actually going to use a conditional here to check if it's equal to the value of true. So if the user checks the checkbox on the front end, this is going to evaluate to true because the value coming through is going to be set to true. And the problem that we had here is that when the user doesn't check the checkbox, there is no value in the post request for this completed field, and it's being set to none on the server because beforehand this completed key did not exist in the dictionary, and therefore it was being set to none, which is the default value of a dictionary.get function when the key does not exist. So I'm going to try this again. Let's go back to the page here, and we're going to add go to restaurant here and submit this, and you can see now we get the value of false. And if I add another to do here, and let's say buy a book, and we're going to check the completed flag, this time that is set to true, and each time we submit this form it's going to append the new row to our existing table body, and that's now because we have the 𝗦merge property set to append on the target element. Now let's finish with a quick look at some of the other merge strategies. If we go back to the 𝗦merge documentation, we can go down to this table here. Now the default, as we saw, is to replace the target element with the incoming element. And we've now also seen append. That's going to append the target element's content with the incoming element. What we can also do is prepend, so let's see an example of that very quickly. If we change the merge strategy to prepend and go back to our page and refresh this page, let's add go to restaurant and we'll check the completed flag, and this time that appears at the very start of the table body's content. So when we prepend the incoming data, it's going to be added at the very start of the content in that target element. Let's go back to the documentation. We also have options to insert the new incoming data before and after the target element. And these, you might notice, are very similar to the HX swap strategies that you can use if you are familiar with HTMX. And that's going to be all for this video. I want to quickly summarize before we finish what we've done in this video. So what we did to start with is create an Alpine.js component, and that was created on this div here using the xData directive. And then we created a key in that xData called to-dos, and we're reading in the JSON content that's being returned from Django for those to-do items. Once we had the to-dos, we were rendering them out in a table here, and then we created a form that allows us to add a new to-do, and we added the Alpine AJAX X target directive to that form, and that means that when the form is submitted, it's going to send a post request to Django, and the Django server then has a view for that request where we extract the data that's been submitted and create a to-do, and then we return a template partial, or a template fragment you might call it, to the Alpine AJAX plugin. And the way Alpine AJAX works is it takes the response content and it swaps it into the document at this target ID that's specified in the xTarget attribute. And if we look at that target, we have the table body here, and we have this ID here, and we also have an 𝗦merge directive from Alpine AJAX. At the moment that's set to prepend, but we can use other strategies as well. And this 𝗦merge directive will tell Alpine AJAX how we want to replace the content or swap the content that's coming back from the server into this target element. So the Alpine AJAX package allows you to pair the interactive functionality of Alpine.js with dynamic content that's returned from the server. And this combination allows you to achieve functionality similar to using HTMX with Alpine.js, but you have the benefit of working entirely with Alpine directives. And this package, Alpine AJAX, it also builds on top of Alpine, and therefore the bundle size is actually very small if you add this to your project. Now I'm going to go back to the documentation right at the end of this video just to demonstrate this. On the left hand side there is a section on comparisons, and if we look at the comparison with HTMX, you can see at the bottom here that HTMX has 13 kilobytes of JavaScript compared to only 3 kilobytes for Alpine AJAX. And you can see other comparisons with 𝗿𝗲VRT and also with libraries like 𝗰𝗿 and Laravel Livewire. Now if you're interested in more content like this, let us know in the comments. If you have any other packages like 𝗰𝗿 that you would like to see some content on, let me know in the comments about that as well. But thanks again for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.